It's great to be here again for the second week. And again, for those who weren't here last week, my name is Will Truesdell, and a picture of my family should go up here right now, if they got it. If they got it. Drum roll, please. But we came from Maine. That's a picture of us at Acadia National Park, where we love to go camping every summer. And our dog is in the picture, who's not with us in Hawaii right now. He's with my folks who live in Maine as well. And just a picture of our town, the next one. This is where we live. It's an idyllic little coastal town in Maine of 3,400 people, many of them lobster fishermen and things like that. We landed there because it was kind of between different places that Lisa and I worked. I was at a college, Bowdoin College in Maine, and she was teaching in an elementary school. And we've stayed there for over 20 years, I think now. And then finally, the last picture in context, this is a team of staff. These are campus staff that work on different colleges and universities in New England, and those are the people that I serve primarily. My role now, after having worked on many campuses and directed ministry in parts of New England, is to serve all of the staff who work within a varsity in the New England area. So that's the 6 states in New England. And my hope is to help them to spiritually thrive, to be in a place where they can serve and give out of an abundance of what God gives to them. In early February, Scott gave a teaching here in your series going through Genesis on day 7 of creation. And that was the day of rest. In that sermon, God talked. I'm elevating you to a pretty high place there. Scott talked about how God really is the author of rest for us. God does the work, and we're invited into that work in a restful posture. And he gave us 3 things in particular: sleep, Sabbath, and salvation that comes through Jesus that allow us to enter into that rest. Today, I'd like to press further into that theme of rest. I work with staff that give and give and give, and often the theme that comes up over and over for them is, how can I rest when I give so much? And I don't know about you, but we live in a very restless world, and I have a hard time resting. Even being here on mostly vacation with my family, there are times I'm going over things in my mind about what's going on back home and trying to fix things in my head that are out of my control right now, being far away. And so today I'd like to look at, what does Jesus model to us about rest in a restless world? I hate buying used cars. Just ask my family. But I absolutely hate it. And so our typical thing is we buy a good used car and drive it until it dies, because the last thing I want to do is try to go through that process again. But recently, we had to do it. In fact, I hate it so much that our car failed inspection in Maine in September, and we just got the next used car the week before we came here. So don't tell the police in Maine. But I didn't want to do it. Put it off. We'd look, and it's just hard. Things about it, I don't want to pay too much for it. I don't want to get a bad deal. I don't want to negotiate. I don't want to get a lemon, which I have done in the past through being very impatient and wanting to get through that process as fast as possible. And my wife and daughter tease me about that all the time. But recently, one came up, and we had to drive down to New Hampshire, met the guy selling the car. We loved the car. The person selling it seemed like a trustworthy person. Everything looked like it was going to work out. It was a Saturday. We could write the check for him that day. But there was one hitch, and that was he still had a loan on the car, which meant that the bank was closed, so we'd have to come back on Monday and complete the deal. That made me a little bit nervous, but still felt like, no, this is worth it. We're going for it. Well, that Monday, I had scheduled something that I do put into my schedule regularly, which is once a month, I try to take time at a little retreat center near my house and just be with the Lord in quiet, without an agenda, simply to rest, receive, hear from God, and really for me to be encouraged in the work that I'm doing. Well, that was scheduled for this Monday that we were going to go down, so I was kind of upset. I'm like, I wanted that day, but I canceled it. We go back down to New Hampshire. It was a crazy crazy day. Lisa and I went down. The kids were back home with my folks. But from trying to figure out the money issue with the loan and the bank and all of that, we're driving down on the phone talking to my bank, their bank, trying to figure out which way to go. Finally, we get there, have that kind of figured out. We want to get the car inspected. We take it to a mechanic. It turns out there were some issues with the transmission. Do we get that fixed or not? Do we drop the deal now? We ended up paying to get it fixed ourselves. Turned out to be fine. Everything had to be done by 5 o'clock when the bank closed. We finished the deal at 4:57 p.m. After the bank said it probably wasn't going to happen. But we got the title, signed it over, and drove home. But I asked the question, when I look back on that day, was I resting? Most of the day, the answer would be no. But what happened in Jesus' experience when stuff like this came up for him? I want to read a story this morning about a pretty intense situation where, just like me, where I was going to be on a quiet day, Jesus was going to bring his disciples after he had just sent them out to towns and villages where he was going to go. They were out on their own for the first time ever, doing the kind of ministry that he had been doing, teaching, healing, seeing God do amazing things through them. They came back, and this was the story that they experienced. I'd like to invite you to picture yourself as one of the disciples in this story. What do you experience in this? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you taste? What do you feel? Get into the story as if you're there. The apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all they had done and taught. Then Jesus said, "Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while." He said this because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. But many people recognized them and saw them leaving, and people from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. Late in the afternoon, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat." But Jesus said, "You feed them." "With what?" they asked. "We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people." "How much bread do you have?" he asked. "Go and find out." They came back and reported, "We have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Then Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of 50 or 100. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. They all ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage. I am here." Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. I think there's three different ways that Jesus experiences rest and teaches and demonstrates it to the disciples in this amazing story. The first one is this: Jesus draws from a deep well. Jesus draws from a deep well. He invites his disciples to come and rest. I love the feel of that. After they expended so much energy, let's go away by ourselves to a quiet place and rest. But when they arrive there, it's not quiet and it's not alone. I can't imagine the feeling in the disciples' hearts seeing that many people and just wanting them to go away so they could have that time of rest. But note Jesus' response. In verse 34, it says that Jesus saw the huge crowd. He stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began teaching them. Jesus has something to give. He's not empty. He's not depleted. He's not frustrated or angry at these people. Instead, he has something from his heart to give to these folks, which says that he's actually in a posture of rest. I don't know about you, but when my plans get frustrated for whatever reason at all, I don't respond this way with compassion, right? That's the last thing on my mind, right? Oh, I'm thinking of you more than me. Not at all. I'm thinking of me far more than you when my plans are interrupted. Jesus isn't like that. In verse 41, I think there's a little picture of that where he has the bread and the fish. He looks up to heaven. He looks up to the Father, then blesses what he has and gives it, and it becomes something that can keep on giving and giving and giving. Jesus isn't a workaholic where he's responding out of some kind of self-preservation need to the needs and demands of people around him. He has a genuine love for the people that are coming, and he's willing to give out of what the Father has already given to him. The disciples, on the other hand, are not exactly in a place of rest, right? They fear, in a sense, the demands of these people. And when Jesus says, you give them something to eat, it just blows up their world, right? There's no way this could happen. So in other words, all these people that are out there are pressing in, and they're a threat to completely deplete the disciples of what they have to give. They're not in a position of rest. Our tendency is always towards self-reliance on our limited and depleting resources. That's just how we tend to live. And that creates a place of unrest in our hearts when demands from outside come in and face us. We can get angry, frustrated, avoidant, demanding. All these things can come out of us compared to Jesus, who's willing to give. Jesus depends on his Father for love and provision and supply. The Father is an unlimited well for Jesus, and he's willing to go there and be able to give to others. For me, I experienced a really hard time in ministry where I had kind of come to the end of my resources in a lot of ways. Things were happening on the outside with Lisa and I, but also within the ministry, and then mostly really just inside of me. I came to a place where I just felt empty, unable to give to the people, the students, and the other staff that I was working with. I think many ministers experience this. We go through times where we feel like we've given it all. And now what do I do when another demand comes across in front of me? But at kind of the crux of that, I went on a retreat. There's a picture of the place that I went to. It's Glastonbury Abbey down right on the shores of Massachusetts. And I didn't have a lot to offer during that retreat. I sat in quiet most of the time, felt really tired. And then one morning when the sun was rising, I was sitting at this desk looking out the window, seeing the light coming up. And I just sensed the presence of God in a very simple way saying, I know. I know. God was saying to me that he understood where I was coming from. He wasn't condemning me. He wasn't pushing me out, but he understood. That, even just that little experience was like a well, a douse of water filling up my well that enabled me to continue to keep going and attend to the things that were happening on the inside of me. What about for you? What would it look like for you to trust in God's provision and love for you in ways that can allow you to be at rest even when demands are pressing in on you? What practice could you hold in your life that could keep you connected to the deep well of God's love and provision? Jesus draws from this deep well, and I believe that's one thing that helps him to experience rest even in the midst of unrest. The second thing Jesus does in this story is he does take time for solitude and for silence. That was the initial invitation he gave to the disciples to go off to that place. And when it got interrupted, Jesus had enough to give. But in the end, he still seeks it out. He sends everybody away after feeding them, including the disciples. And that's a disturbing thing for me, right? He invited the disciples to come to a place of rest. He ends up feeding everybody. Then he insists that the disciples get into the boat to go to the other side without him. It feels a little bit like he's punishing them. You know, it's like, okay, you guys, you dropped the ball, you didn't get it, get in the boat, get out of here, I'm going up to the mountains to be with God. But I think something else might be going on here. Yes, in the end we hear that the disciples' hearts were hardened, they didn't quite understand what was going on. But I think what Jesus is doing here is prioritizing silence and solitude as the very things that he needs in order to keep going on. And so he's willing to even send the disciples out into a storm to get the time that he needs to be with God. Our tendency is to resist silence and solitude. Jesus' tendency is to enter into it. Why do we resist it? While we've been here this week, my son, who's 9 years old, we brought him to a store in Ala Moana. Some of you may have been to it. It's called It's Sugar. These places should be illegal, right? So, and on the bags it's like Sugar Rush, and just the more you get, the more sugar is it. But man, you walk into that store and it's like the opposite of silence and solitude, right? It's like complete visual exposure. It's like overload. There's loud music blaring on. There's kids running everywhere. It's an absolute zoo. Compare that to this next slide. This is a picture of Orion in the sky. I love the stars. I studied physics and astronomy. That could have been one of my career paths that I was exploring when I was out here after graduating from college, instead of going into ministry. But I still love to look up. Every time I go outside at night, I look up and see the stars. And where we live in Maine, we have incredibly dark, dark skies. I can see the Milky Way on any evening. I can see thousands and thousands of stars, and it changes every night as I go out and look. And there's something about standing underneath the stars that puts us in our place. Going into It's Sugar doesn't, right? Going outside at night, we're small. We can't control the world. We can't fix the problems that are out there. We're so limited. And solitude and silence often exposes those limits that we have, and it makes us vulnerable. And we don't want to go there. And so we fill our lives with anything that can fill that gap. The biggest thing that I think is a threat to silence and solitude today is this, right? It's just so at our fingertips to answer any question, to fill that gap while we're waiting in line or whatever it might be. We just don't stop. And even if I pause for 5 seconds there, we start feeling uncomfortable, right? We're used to hearing people talk. But silence and solitude are Jesus' way, I think, of recentering himself. He knows he's just a man, but he's also God. But in this human cloak, he can only do what the Father will do through him. And so silence and solitude, though vulnerable, enable him to connect to God and give. It helps him to rest. An example in ministry about struggling with silence and solitude is with one of the staff that I've worked with named Megan. I think there's a picture of her. We had a retreat where we asked the staff to go for about 5 or 6 hours just on their own in quiet and solitude to be with the Lord. After about 30 minutes, Megan came up to me and Hallie, who was the other one leading the retreat, and she's like, I can't do this. She was an athlete, like hockey player, used to just being full on adrenaline, going, very successful kind of person. And she's like, I can't just sit still. Could I go for a run instead and experience silence and solitude while I run? And we said, yes, go for it. Go for a run. So she went running. We were on the banks of a river, and there was an outcropping of rocks that fell down to the water where the rapids were rushing by. And she was running on a path down by the water. Now, the context is that in the midst of her being an athlete, a lot of her ministry ended up connecting with athletes at the university she was ministering at. And she started a couple small groups with different teams and found that people were really engaging with Jesus. Their lives were being changed. She saw some people healed. God was doing some amazing things. And she began to think, what if this could be happening all over the nation, every university? Like, she had this vision, but she felt so small and so unable to do it. And so in her experience of silence and solitude while she's running along the banks of this river, she sees trees growing out of the rocks, like curving up like this, right out of the rocks, shooting up into the sky, 80, 90 feet tall. And she just stopped and looked at them. And it was like the Lord was saying to her, Megan, if I can let trees grow out of rocks, don't worry about what I can do with you. Years later, she actually became the national director for athletes ministry in InterVarsity, and thousands of students' lives have been changed because Megan went and was alone and quiet with the Lord, and he spoke to her. What if she hadn't taken that time? She probably would have lived on with her own limits and insecurities. God knows how to get our attention, but I wonder what might have happened if she didn't take that time. So Jesus draws from a deep well. Jesus takes time for silence and solitude. And then the last thing is that Jesus is not in a hurry. Jesus is not in a hurry. Notice the pace. In verse 32, they're on a boat ride. They get into the boat and they're going across the lake. If you've ever sailed, you're not in a hurry when you're sailing. You're at the mercy of the wind, right? Next, Jesus chooses to teach these people. So imagine an afternoon, a full afternoon, people around this big area. It's grassy, trees. They're seeking shade at different times, and Jesus is teaching. There's no rush there. People then sit and eat a meal in the evening. And then finally, after he sends everybody away, Jesus hikes up to a mountain to a quiet, lonely place. There's no rushing in this story. And now in verse 48, it says, about 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward the disciples walking on the water. He walks. In the midst of all the demands, in the midst of a real storm, he walks. The disciples, meanwhile, want to send people away. They're rowing hard against the waves. They're in a place of tumult and hurry. That's our tendency, is to hurry. It's to hurry, to fight against the limits that we face. Think of your relationship with time. So often we're fighting time. Just yesterday morning, I was eager to get out. We had a hike planned, and we had a reserved time to get up there, up in Palihua camp. We were going up there in the Waianaes. And we had to get there by 8, so my family's getting ready. I'm like, we gotta go. And Lisa and Julia were in the kitchen upstairs sitting there, and they were both kind of placing bets on the kind of thing that I would either come and say or do, turning the corner, looking at them in the kitchen, and they were both right. I was so fixated on time and trying to fight time and the limits. Traffic, deadlines, schedules, daylight. It's like they all work against us and our ideals of efficiency and getting things done. We never seem to get ahead. Dallas Willard, when asked by somebody, what's the one thing I could do in my life that could really help my relationship with God or help my life in general? And his answer was, ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. John Swinton is a theologian who spent a lot of time with disabled people, and he tells a story about a Down syndrome boy having to tie his shoes. And he asks the question, how long does it take for him to tie his shoes? And his answer is, as long as his body takes to tie the shoes. We have a very different relationship with that kind of an experience, right? We want to get it done, not in the time that it takes, but in enough time for us to do what we want to do. In the world of the disabled, or even children, it takes the time that it takes, right? So we invent Velcro shoes, right? We're still fighting that relationship with time. While we fight that, Jesus takes the time that's needed. Jesus takes the time that's needed. He accepts the limits. By drawing from the well, by seeking silence and solitude, he can go slowly. John Swinton says that of all the times and places that God could have come into our world, he came in a time and place in Jesus where Jesus walked. And he says, our God is a 3.5-mile-an-hour God. He's not rushing, he's never in a hurry, and he takes the time needed to do what needs to be done. Think of your own life, the things that you'd like to see changed in you, the way you'd love to see something change in you to help make your way of living better or your person better. God's going to take the time he needs to do that. I still wish he'd hurry up. How do we apply this? I think a life of rest that helps us to slow down embraces limits. A life of rest embraces limits. For the disciples, the 5,000 plus people, the storm, they both produce different kinds of fear in them. They're outside forces challenging the limits that they have to be able to meet what's in front of them, whether it's a storm or feeding them. For Jesus, both of these are chances for him to turn to the Father in trust. And in both cases, the Father overcomes the limits that were in front of him in miraculous ways. We can't do everything. We can't save the world. But what we can do is be who God has made us to be and allow him to work in our life in a way that makes a difference in this world. One of the staff that I've worked with recently, his name is Eli, and there's a picture of a group of them. He is on the middle right-hand side, a big black guy there. He's a football player. Originally, he was from a poor family in Haiti that came over, really escaping by boat, landed in Florida, sought asylum. They ended up settling there, lived in poverty most of his life, growing up in high school, but became proficient in sports, soccer and football and everything, and absolutely fell in love with it. And while he struggled in school, with the language and all those things, sports kind of got him through. And he ended up getting a football scholarship to a school in Ohio, went there, and his freshman year, he blew out his knee in such a bad way that he just could not play anymore. It was through that experience, though, the experience of his limits, that he met Jesus in a powerful way. The faith that he had kind of heard about growing up became his through and through, and his life was really changed. He felt a call to ministry, and for the last 10 years has been ministering on different campuses in Ohio. And we did this discernment group over the fall into the winter, into January of this year, and that's where I met Ellie, was through doing that with him. And it turned out he was really wondering if he should leave ministry. And the reason is because he felt like the way he was brought up and the way he experienced God and the way he was really longing to do ministry didn't fit the mold of the other people he saw ministering in churches or even in university. He kept trying over and over again to fit that mold, but he kept hitting the limits that he just wasn't like that, and he was so tired. And he thought, I'm just not cut up for this. I need to go. And so through this cohort where we met several times over the course of the fall and then finally in a retreat together, he began to see that God actually had made him the way he was. He had given him the experiences of his life growing up, and that those were gifts to him, not limits. And as he began to embrace that, God began to really renew his vision and give him a new sense of hope for not only the campus, but also for him. And by slowing down, by paying attention to those things, by encountering the limits that were in his life with the Lord, he's become really a new minister with a lot to give. And he's already starting to make some changes in ministry that are really exciting to see. He's learning to walk in ministry, not trying to fit the mold or go fast, but at 3.5 miles an hour, just as God made him to be. I think that's true for so many of us. We see the way the Christian life should be led, and we think we should fit that mold. God's made you the way he's made you. And you're going to live that life with him in an intimate and real way at 3.5 miles an hour. You don't need to rush or hurry. What would it look like for you to embrace your limits, to slow down, to stop fighting time, and take the time that's needed for whatever is before you? Where are you typically in a hurry? What is your relationship to time and to limits? These are great questions that I think Jesus brings up in this story for the disciples and for us. Jesus took time to draw from the deep well, to seek solitude and silence, and finally, to embrace the limits and go slow. I hope we can do the same thing. But at the very end of this story, Jesus does one more thing. In verse 50 and 51, he spoke to them in the boat in the midst of the storm, and he said, "Don't be afraid." He said, "Take courage, I am here." Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped. Jesus wants to get into your boat. On that day when Lisa and I were going to finally get the car and all these crazy things were happening, I did feel that sense over and over again where Jesus wanted to get into my boat. And when I was worrying about this or worrying about that or fretting about this, that he just wanted to meet me and say, "Relax, I've got this covered." And that's exactly what he does for these disciples. He gets in the boat, the storm is calmed, and the disciples are amazed. Only Jesus can truly bring the rest that we long for in this life. This world is frustrated. It's stuck in our rebellious ways of sin, Romans says. And it's waiting for the day when God's kids are going to be revealed. It's waiting for that day. And Jesus wants to make us his children. But the way to do that, and the disciples don't quite get it yet in this story, but I think we can. It requires one simple thing, and that's called repentance. That's a big word, but it basically means changing your mind. For us, if we're hurrying through life, if Jesus is outside of our boat and we're relying on our own depleted resources, if we're facing our limits and trying to power through them, if we're not experiencing rest in this life, simply saying, "Oh, I've blown it there," turning around, letting him into your boat is the way towards rest. And Jesus wants to give that. He wants to give forgiveness, cleansing, renewal, rest, real eternal life, and peace that lasts. Our world is clamoring for that. And what would it look like, church, right, if we embodied that in such a way that we went through life, we went through our experiences, whether it's with family or friends or coworkers or anybody that we're around, and we lived in the way that Jesus lives in this story? I think people would be flocking to want to know what's going on, because we're all longing for the kind of rest that Jesus gives him. May we be that kind of people. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this story. I know if I was one of the disciples, the story would have ended the same way, where I just didn't get it. I was still hard of heart and unable to understand. But Lord, I pray you could penetrate our hearts. I pray you could help us to let you into our boats in ways that can bring true, deep, abiding rest, and that might be a witness to folks around who don't know you and are longing for that kind of rest. And pray that in Jesus' name. Amen.